Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and today we're returning to the Spheres trilogy by Peter Sloterdijk. We're still in Bubbles. After chapter 4, we're going to do Excursus 2. And Excursus 2 is called Nobjects and Unrelationships on revision of psychoanalytical stage theory, on the revision of psychoanalytical stage theory. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I just wanted to return briefly to sort of contextualize because it's been a while. And so we're looking at the womb, the experience of the womb, as being the kind of origin point of our lives, to which, in some sense, we're always trying to return. And so he's going to be considering these ideas of like nobject or no object or no subject or something like that. Because the fetus within the womb exists in a universe which is pre-subjective and pre-objective. There's a kind of withness. Things are experienced, but they're experienced in a kind of shadowy, non-objective way, right? As just relating there, as making contact with, but this contact is sort of hasn't been differentiated out yet into subjects and objects. And the idea, I think, is this sort of immunizing function always tries to recreate this. And that's where this idea of the morphology of the sphere comes from. The womb sort of is the shape of immunity. If you remember, as per the interview I read some of before in a video by Peter Sloterdijk, he says that a life is the success phase of an immune system. And so the idea is the immune system is constructed, and from out of that immune system, when it's functioning well, life emerges. It's a product of a fully formed sort of immune system. And so this morpho-immunity is being established before subjects and objects. And once this space is really cultivated, a subject is then able to emerge. So in this world in which we're not a subject, but we exist and have experience, potentially, this formative realm for us, that's what we're going to examine now, negative gynecologically. We're going to explore it. And he extends this idea of like Freudian stages in the development of the mind to encompass moments within the womb in order to do that. And so he begins in Excursus 2 with, again, some commentary on psychoanalysis and Freud. And he thinks that the Freudian analysis stopped short. Again, it's because of this sort of bourgeois character of Freudianism. And he says basically the Freudianism has this kind of emphasis developmentally on object relations. So you have the oral stage, and in the oral stage, the breast is the object. And development occurs in the subject in relationship to this object of the breast. In the anal stage, it's the anus, feces. And so he says this object prejudice deforms our understanding of infantile and fetal modes of reality. It isn't just wrong, it's pathogenically wrong. There are no traces of subjectivity and objectivity in our most early situations. And so he thinks only a medial or a psychosomatically medial analysis is capable of representing this resonance reciprocal relationship of suspension in a bipolar ether, is the way he says it. So we need to add at least 3 stages prior to the oral stage, he thinks. And the oral stage is being what Freud thinks is the sort of first stage of psychosexual development. And so he says the first of these 3 stages is a phase of fetal cohabitation in which the incipient child experiences the sensory presence of liquids, soft bodies, and cave boundaries. Most importantly, the placental blood, amniotic sac, and a kind of vague prefiguring of the experience of spatial boundaries through the resistance of the abdominal wall and elastic walling in. Everything is just sort of subtle suggestion, shadowy existences in this kind of fluidal, spheric realm that the fetus exists in. And he refers to Thomas Macho here, who unfortunately I don't know anything about outside of what Sloterdijk says about him, so I can't really give you background. But he says that Thomas Macho calls this, uses the term no objects in order to refer to things kind of in this realm or in this state, because they're things that aren't quite subjects, they're not quite objects, because there's no subject counterpart. You can't have objects if you don't have a subject. And so if a subject hasn't emerged from out of this mess, then its experience can't really be said to be things like objects, because you're not, separate from analyzing in a kind of present at hand mode or something like that, you might say, to talk about it in kind of Heideggerian language. And remember, Heidegger is very important for Sloterdijk. And so they're pre-subjective, they're pre-objective. It's like a kind of being with, again, in this Heidegger sort of sense, a kind of mid-sign. There's a withness of things, pre-subjective and pre-objective. And this withness can produce effect and leave traces. It can be an important part of our experience, especially in terms of this sort of concept of morpho-immunity, I think. And so it can leave traces in terms of our, in terms of later transference and stuff like that. The placenta as a nurturing primal companion to the fetus, harbinger, object, shadow of a first counterpart. The placenta stands in for that. The placenta is a kind of first counterpart to the fetus. And later it's going to, that position in this kind of triadic biune structure is going to be very important. But placenta is what first occupies that. We'll talk about it in a little bit. The next two chapters are going to will be about the relationship between the fetus and the subject, and the placenta and the companion. And remember, this is just to be clear, this is still just bubbles. We're still just talking about intimate biune spheric relationships. Bubbles are about intimate relationships, right? And we're at the most intimate and the most primary type of bubble right now is what we're talking about in the book. But it's very, it's possible that you guys are going to be much more interested in what happens in globes and what happens in foams. I've thought about trying to skip to that or something. If you're more interested in that sort of thing, then, you could skip. We're not going to be talking about the fetus exactly forever, though. But it is important. It's formative. If you are more interested in like the era of globalizations and political spheres and things like that, you might choose to move on. But I think that all of it's interesting. But I just thought that I would go ahead and say that. It'll be a while before we get to that stuff. But to me, that's the most interesting too. But I do think that this is an important kind of formative understanding that we're elaborating here for understanding all this later stuff, like especially the concept of the magic circle and things like that. But in any event, the next two chapters will be about the relationship between the fetus and the subject, and the placenta and the companion. Those are two parts in this structure that I'm talking about. But the earliest Nobject is the placental blood. There's a constant placenta-mediated exchange of blood between the mother and the child. And so the blood is not just the blood of the one, but creates the first intimate medial bond between interlocked dyadic partners. Right? We have in this biune, there's always a mediating element. And for Sloterdijk, that's going to be extremely important. I think there's a case to be made that really he's sort of at base what he's doing is kind of media theory, but that doesn't encapsulate everything. But but I have thought that before. So the blood mediates a kind of biunity, and so there's at the start there's three elements that turn two into one. In the second stage, the second media field, he says, concerns the psychoacoustic initiation of the fetus into the uterine sound world, and this seems really significant to me. That like the fact that infants are born being able to recognize their mother's voices and things like that. It's like there's a kind of sonic umbilical cord already at birth that's been established between the mother and the infant. And then, like, even in the other direction, the cry of the infant stimulates the production of milk. If you talk to women who have breastfed and stuff like that, they'll tell you, like, they hear crying and they start to produce, right? So there's this kind of sonic connection, like a sonic acoustic mediation between mother and infant that creates a bond between them that's already there when the child is born, which lends a lot of credence, I think, to talking about, this sort of former womb world, right? And these kind of womb experiences of no objects and the effects that it has on us as being crucial. But in this kind of fetal sonosphere, it consists of objects because sound you can't confront like an object. You become kind of possessed by it and then it's gone. And so the fetus sits in this sort of vibrating ocean. In the third phase, he says it's referred to by Thomas Macho as the respiratory phase, in which the first partner in the outside world for the fetus is the air that it breathes. The first thing that it encounters, replacing the lost amniotic fluid as the successive element. The air, again, is a medial factor, meaning that it can't be grasped through objective language. And this new medial element also provides the first chance, he says, at self-activity, at respiratory autonomy. And he thinks an analysis of breath of air would have disabused psychoanalysis of its object fixation had they thought seriously about it. He does say that Macho says that psychoanalysis has long discovered reasons to sublate ostensible subject-object relations into a thinking about medial processes, but they've repressed that possibility. You might say defended themselves against it. And he thinks that an analysis of medial processes is really this kind of revision of psychoanalysis that focuses on this aspect is really the only possible way into a suitable language for closeness. And then he goes on to say, psychoanalysis then would be able to state openly that every animation is a media event, and that all psychological disturbances are distortions of participation, media sicknesses, one could say. And so the fixation on objects is itself the logical matrix of a neurosis, of a kind of civilizational neurosis. And he says it needs hardly be pointed out which civilization suffers from this neurosis like no other. Then there's a kind of strange break in the book where he's like into another excursus or back into the previous chapter, but there's a weird thing going on with the chapter like footnote headings. If someone can explain that to me that has more familiarity with what's going on there, that would be cool, but I'm not gonna ignore it. I'm not sure, it might just be like a typo or something, but then he goes back into, so what is negative gynecology? We want to resist two temptations in this negative gynecological mode. One is resist the kind of objectifying gaze, considering, subjects, objects are present at hand for the analysis of a subject who stands above them and has, full access to and can describe the properties of said object, blah, blah, blah. We want to resist that kind of mode of investigation or mode of analysis. And on the other hand, we want to resist this kind of temptation toward total immersion in a kind of transcendent initiatory experience in which the subject us as subjects dissolves into the wholeness or the oneness of this kind of mystical experience. We want to resist both of those kinds of temptations. He's got some interesting stuff that he says, like stories about Lao Tzu being, gestating, I guess, for like 84 years or something, and he says some stuff about that I'm sort of going to skip over. For the Chinese, they consider the implantation as birth. So when children are born, they're already considered to be 1 year old, and he's got some kind of poetical commentary on this, but we're going to skip it for now. And then he goes on to talk about Artie Laing, and he was a countercultural, avant-garde, psychoanalytic figure. He was part of the New Left, but he was vilified by the psychology orthodoxy as being conservative because he opposed electroconvulsive therapy and all the new drugs. He didn't think that psychopathology should be treated in a kind of medical, biological way, and I totally agree with that. But he started doing rebirthing stuff because he was really interested in the fetal experience, and the traumas of being born he thought were central psychologically. Sloterdijk says that Artie Laing views implantation as the primal event in a life's history. And he points out that no one can really know whether it's experienceable or re-experienceable, but he thinks, Artie Laing thinks, that an overarching memory of all states and changes is built up from the first cell. So he takes sort of the genetic method of a Marx or a Vico very seriously. But Sloterdijk quotes Artie Laing here pretty extensively, and he says that's basically because he's a good example of negative gynecology, because in all of these quotations you'll see he switches from analytical descriptive prose, like theoretical analysis, and then he'll switch into these sort of dreamlike reveries and poetry and things like that. And so he's sort of moving back and forth, in this negative gynecological way between sort of standing outside and looking at an object, and also, becoming attuned to the sort of phenomenological experience of the fetus in this way that can't be described, that's nobjective or whatever. And he says that the intrauterine experience obviously doesn't really fit in with analytical descriptions, and that's why Artie Laing has to move into kind of poetic, dreamlike descriptions too, because in the womb there's no syntax, which is very interesting to me also, because Freud describes the unconscious as lacking syntax. And so there's just constant connection to psychoanalysis, but I think that's pretty interesting, that the unconscious is sort of the determinative factor for human psychology, and the structure of the unconscious, you might say, is, kind of based on a womb-like experience or something, that we're still stuck in the womb in the unconscious. That's the way that I would sort of try to poetically put it. And he says that, interestingly to me, he says the aim of deconstruction is a kind of return to this sort of just semantic plasma, possibility being totally reabsorbing the real, and then in such a way that as soon as you produce a thesis about it, just try to describe it in a literal, logical sort of way, you've falsified the experience. So he's saying deconstruction is an attempt to destroy all of this syntactic arrangement of things, because in some sense they're kind of falsifying experience, and just sort of return to this sort of womb-like semantic plasma, infinite possibility. I thought that was interesting. He then compares this kind of experience to nirvana, and he says the equation of womb and nirvana cannot amount to a claim about the individual's experience of emptiness, as often is done, because the fetus with which the mother is pregnant is itself pregnant with its own tendency to fill out its space and affirm itself within it. This gets at some of the interesting themes in Sloterdijk that I think are very important, like this drive to fill out space and spatialize and things like that. And the relationship between this kind of, morphological spatializing activity and neurosis and pathology and things like that. When I read Bronze Age Mindset, Bronze Age Pervert persistently refers to this, like, especially men, I think he thinks, have a need to own their space. Right, to like be the master of a domain or something like that, and to expand that domain. And when I was reading that, I was thinking a lot about Sloterdijk, and I was thinking that it seems like Bronze Age Pervert has probably read Sloterdijk, but no one has made this connection, and I'm not sure why. It seems like an important one to understanding what Bronze Age Pervert is doing. Not that I think it's like that's like a super serious philosophical work or something. I enjoyed it. It's not really a super serious philosophical work. It's not dry enough. It's not boring enough. No, but it's more something like On the Road or something like that. I thought of making a video on it, but I actually listened to it in audiobook form and don't understand how the note-taking in the app works or how to retrieve them. Now I don't even have a membership, so the notes that I took are gone, and it's sort of harder to do that when you're listening anyway. So I didn't wind up making a video about it, but I was thinking that the Sloterdijk connection it seems to be very important, and no one has pointed it out as far as I'm aware. It's more of like a kind of on the road book or something like that. But yeah, he's like the primordial experience of human beings in this kind of fetal womb space is not empty. It's the opposite of empty. You're floating in these sort of amniotic waters, inhabiting an acoustic event space, subject to constant stimulation, where you're developing this kind of companionship with the placenta and things like that. So it's not at all a kind of empty, void experience. And if we move out of subjecthood, into a kind of pre-subjective, pre-objective universe, we don't achieve emptiness or nothingness. It's full. There's a fullness, a constant stimulation to it. And he says it's also not any movement from an I to a we when you're born, but in fact the archaic biunity of the we is split into the ego into second element later, right? In the most archaic phase of existence, we have a biunity of mother, child, placenta, blood, etc. Whether you think about it acoustically or amniotically or whatever you want to think about it as, there's always, again, this sort of biunity, like a trinity biunity oneness that exists. And then after you're born, he says, then you split into an ego and a second element, which crystallizes out into a third in mediation of the ego and the second element. And the splitting is only possible because the biune itself is medially conditioned. It's always a dyadic triad. And one of the interesting things to me is this threeness. Like there's a perpetual kind of threeness going on here. And it's important for psychoanalysis too. For example, as in the Oedipal complex, which he is about to list. He lists three of these kind of dyadic triunes as examples here. The first one being fetus, blood as the medial element, mother. The second one is newborn, and then something like the milk or the voice, infant's voice or mother's voice, and mother, right, is the third one, where milk or voice is the medial element. And then the Oedipal one he lists, which is the important psychoanalytic one, the Oedipal triad, the child, the father or language, if you're into Lacan, and then the mother, the father or language being a kind of medial element with respect to the mother. And he thinks the medial element is always crucial, and true issues of the primary fetal and perinatal world, blood, amniotic fluid, voice, sonic bubble, breath, they're all media of a pre-visual universe in which mirror concepts, Lacan again, and their libidinous connotations are entirely out of place. The child's earliest autoeroticisms, auto in quotes, are eo ipso based on games of resonance, not mirrorings of the self, not looking at the self reflected in a different mirror, in a different medium, but a resonance between the companion and the infant. Right? And when the concern is, as it is for Sloterdijk, insight into intimate connections, outside observation alone is already the fundamental mistake. Hence, we have this need for negative gynecology. And he says the intimate Atlantis cannot be moved to rise from the sea again for the purpose of its exploration. You cannot go on a direct diving mission as a researcher because the lost continent also lies sunken in time, not just space. And so the only means of reconstruction are archaeological. Traces in ancient emotional finds. And so he says the current Atlanteans, the new fetuses, refuse to give us information, unfortunately. But he says we shouldn't draw the wrong conclusions about their silence with respect to being in the cave and a thinking of this idea of being in the cave and the earliest kind of experiences. And, like I was saying earlier, the kind of establishment of a paradigm of morpho-immunity, right? I think all the morphology talk is rooted in this kind of archaic experience of the womb. and in terms of understanding it via this kind of triadic biune structure. We'll get on to the next chapter next time. I think it's another excursus, but it might be a short one, so I might do the next chapter and the excursus in one video. But for now, take care. Don't simply react, but think culture.